All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and today we're going into our second part of the political history of the United States. And we're starting with uh, the Haudenosaunee. And I'm not going to spell that, except it will be in the title. Um, and you're going to be wondering, wait, what does a Native American culture have to do with American politics, government, and society, considering most Americans consider themselves of European descent? Well, we'll find out not just a little bit today, but in the future. But to figure out the what, we need to understand where the what and the why came from. So we're delving into some Native American history. Now, I'm going to use the endonym for the Confederation, which is the Haudenosaunee, which means people of the Longhouse. Very rough translation, by the way. Um, and until the sixth nation joined, it was actually the Five Nations. And the original Five Nations were the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Oneida, Mohawk, and Seneca nations. In 1722, the Tuscarora joined. A few other Algonquin slash Iroquoian or Haudenosaunee language group nations that never did join would include, say, the Cherokee. Now, here on the screen you have a map of roughly the territory that the people inhabited during the existence of the Haudenosaunee Confederation, which is mostly what I'm going to be talking about today, right? And it wasn't really a government, so to speak. It was kind of just a uniting law that kept peace between the constituent nations and each other. Any purely internal matter between the nations, such as any matter that only affected, say, the Cayuga, or maybe even trade between, say, Cayuga and the Oneida, or the Seneca and Tuscarora, that would be handled between those nations in particular. But if it was, say, a declaration of war or an overarching policy decision that needed to be made between all, and that would affect all constituent nations of the Haudenosaunee, that would require a Grand Council, which was pretty interesting. And I've got some stuff. By the way, the Grand Council that they have still exists, and they still make decisions much the similar way to the way they did back before the colonial period. Um, and for a treaty to be binding, uh, three-quarters of men and three-quarters of women on the ground in the council must ratify, requiring a double supermajority effectively, because um, you have to have, because actually the Haudenosaunee were, some would say, matriarchal or matrilineal. Basically, the mothers, the women, were more politically important than the men. The men's duty was to fight war and to trade. The women were there to actually run their society. And so the women were afforded the power to do so. Now, there's conflicting reports of exactly how long the Confederation lasted, but the earliest people can find was in the 1400s, so before Columbus even showed up, though you could maybe make an argument that each member nation, such as the Onondaga, Mohawk, had lived in these areas since, in their words, it'd be time immemorial, but for as long as the sun is risen and the moon is, you know, stuff like that. But certainly some unifying culture was definitely around for a long time before serious colonial settlement, but certainly before even Columbus. Um, I would say 1400s is probably an accurate description for when they actually unified into a nation, um, into one entity, the Haudenosaunee Confederation. And what would happen is decisions would be passed from one nation's delegation to another, and you would need very close to unanimity. You would need all delegations to agree, but not necessarily all the people within each delegation. And we'll talk about where and why that's important, especially in terms of American government later. Um, but in general, um, the Confederation was probably unique in that even up until the American Revolution, it maintained a level of independence that very few other native nations could even achieve. They were diplomatically not necessarily on a level footing, but very close. They were able to make treaties with the colonial powers that the British and the French actually respected, to the degree that the British and French could respect a native people. And the straw that did break the camel's back, because there was some disunity, starting really with the British and French rivalry in the Ohio River Valley. But what eventually did break the Confederation to an extent, even though, like I said, the Confederation actually still exists, at least in terms of their Grand Council and all of that. But for the most part, the Confederation as a political entity was broken by the American Revolution, because some people, some of the member nations wanted to side with the Americans, some wanted to side with the Brits. Actually, most wanted to side with the Brits, and given how American history has panned out, that maybe was the correct decision in that war. But the Americans certainly made overtures to the Haudenosaunee. Just didn't pan out. And I think without colonization or a colonial period, their great law of peace, which is basically that no nation within the Confederation will go to war with another nation, and that you will not have violence between the people who are members of the Confederation. It was kind of a way of saying, listen, we're going to be better off if we don't fight each other. I think it would have lasted for a very, very long time. And maybe it would have solidified into an actual nation state as the Europeans would recognize it. Whether or not it would have been able to progress, technologically speaking, is a different story altogether. And we could discuss for ages and ages why Native American cultures never really progressed technologically speaking, and it was simply because of agriculture. There were no real large herd animals, pack animals, livestock type animals in the Americas that were actually useful, and that were easily tamed. You could say bison in the Great Plains, but those aren't easily tamed. And the only other livestock that would be easy to keep in one place and tame were small. Turkeys, even then, Native Americans weren't really interested in domestication. You're not going to domesticate deer. You can, but in terms of making them livestock, it's not going to work. So all agriculture was done by hand, thus limiting the size of the farms and limiting the ability to centralize and have a lot of people. Down in Central America, it's actually surprising the level of technology they were able to get to and achieve, given the fact that they also had no livestock. If you went down to South America, you would have a slightly different story in the Andes with the alpacas and llamas, but that's a much different story for a much different day. But going back and discussing the Haudenosaunee, it's remarkable the sophisticated. Again, I'm hesitant to call it a government because it really wasn't a government. It was more just a universal agreement that they would all work together to avoid conflict between each other, and that they would, defend each other from external threats. More like a slightly stronger alliance between nations. Kind of almost a European Union situation, except a lot less centralized, and requiring everyone to agree before a decision is enacted. It was brilliant and it worked for a very, very long time. And it probably would have continued to work for far longer had it not been for colonization. And you'll later see quite a few people also thought it was a very good idea to have a system like the Haudenosaunee. But overall, the Iroquois people were a very important culture and a very important influence on American government and American politics moving forward. Effectively, they created what we would now call federalism. And we'll talk about that much more in the future. Anyway, I'm going to end it here. I hope everyone enjoyed. If you're new to the channel, likes, comments, subscriptions, they always do help, and I greatly appreciate them. And I hope everybody has a very nice evening. Take it easy, y'all. Bye-bye.